Hello and welcome everyone to the Fellows Colloquium, and I'm obviously not Kate Younger, but I'm sitting in because poor Kate is feeling a little poorly, that's all to my advantage because I've had a few conversations with Mikhail since he arrived here in Vienna, and I can guarantee you won't be disappointed by tonight's colloquium. I don't really know where to start with Mikhail's career because it is so broad and varied. He graduated from Kiev Mohila University as a doctor.
No, before Kiev Mohila as philosopher.
As a philosopher, where he wrote on Kant. But he won't be writing. He won't be talking about Kant this evening because the span of his knowledge and his subjects is just enormous. I can't begin to go through them all, but he's a political philosopher who also works as the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Ideology and Politics. He also runs the Ukrainian blog at the Kennan Center at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, and we've just been talking about his work at the Free University, which is largely made up of professors from the post-Soviet space who are gathered together online and who teach students from around the world in a voluntary project which is extremely admirable. But he's been a visiting professor at Harvard and various other places around Europe, and I'm not going to go through them all, but what he's going to talk about tonight is the democratic and autocratic outcomes of the post-Soviet political development, 1991 to 2022, looking at four former territories of the Soviet Union, that's Estonia, Ukraine, the Russian Federation, and Uzbekistan, comparing their autocratic and democratic tendencies, outcomes, stability, and so forth. And it is guaranteed to be a very interesting talk, and afterwards we'll all be able to ask him questions. So Mikhail,
thank you, Misha.
I'm going to sit in the front so I can see the slides as they come through.
Yes. Well, thank you all for coming today. I usually find November the worst period for evening lectures. It's cold. By the end of the day your energies are gone, so I really appreciate for coming and listening to a lecture which is based on an overlap of philosophy, history and political science. And my today's talk is based on the last chapter of a book that I was writing here in the Institute. It was Misha Glenny's fault for pushing me into writing it in the third language. First, the plan was to write it in Ukrainian and Russian. And Misha offered to do it also in English, which, well, Russian and Ukrainian versions already were very different. But when you try to explain the post-Soviet experience to someone far away from the area, from the region, then it's even more difficult. A number of footnotes was growing, so that at a certain moment I started beating my hands, not adding them. But basically what we're gonna talk today is a biography of post-Soviet human, or post-Soviet humans. In a way, when the war started, I started thinking, what was the legacy that post-Soviet history left? Definitely, when the war in February 22 started, we all were pushed into a new historical, social universe. So in a way, this caesura created by the decision of Putin to attack Ukraine was already changing history. And you probably heard from Putin and also from Obama this expression, we are on the right side of history. And this dialogue of two presidents is one thing, but actually this reference to history is very important because indeed, in February 22, history changed and the new period is about to come. But what was before? I was telling my friends today that, well, today is the 10th anniversary of the beginning of Euromaidan. It started 10 years sharp with this famous Facebook message of Mustafa Nayyem, let's go protest to the decision of Prime Minister to postpone the sign-off of the association agreement with Ukraine. And I was looking at the photos, my photos and my friends' photos from Euromaidan, and I felt it's really a different story, it's a different epoch. It is full of creativity, some goodness at heart, and we lived in totally different period. So when I started writing the book, it was about post-Soviet humans. And when I say post-Soviet human, is a byproduct of a self-overcoming of a Soviet man. And again, when I use these two terms, Soviet man, post-Soviet humans, I refer to anthropocultural typologies. And Soviet man was produced consciously based on ideology. Post-Soviet humans were many different subforms and they were not caused by one ideology, but there was some dialectics and logic behind it. And also this short biography of post-Soviet humans, it lasted for approximately 30 years, from caesura of 1989-91, when the Cold War ended, when Soviet Union was released, when decommunization started, when political and ideological pluralism was flourishing first in Soviet Union and then in post-Soviet worlds, you literally feel how Soviet man who didn't have experience of, like first-hand experience of political freedom, tries to create the world of politically free world. And that's amazing how it's connected. This revolutionary period of caesura was full of destruction and creation at the same time. You probably remember this Dahrendorf's expression or notion, destructive creativity. He actually took this expression from Zombart, and it was going deeper than just political, economic idea in description of capitalism and how it gets revived through all the crises. It's actually how history is being made. We have periods that start with caesura, with rupture of one period, of one trajectories. We enter into new continuity. So history is like a sequence of caesuras, continuities, new caesuras, and at very different levels. So when I talk about 1991, is the end of caesura connected with social, economic, cultural, and political processes. And you probably remember Levada's team's work on studying Soviet men, how he or they disappear and how they get reborn in Russia. But in reality, Soviet men existed in Estonia, in Uzbekistan, in some small villages and big urban centers. And reinvention was taking place everywhere, literally, in these revolutions and at different levels. In public sphere, in economy, in sexual life, because in this caesura of 89 and 91, we have public revolutions. that deal with political structures, with statehood, with governance, but also with private spheres. What means totalitarianism? It's when public sphere grows so much that it enters into the private sphere. Family, religion, business, everything becomes public. And then public sphere loses its own logic, but also private sphere is gone. Or in the language of Habermas, it's when system takes over the Lebenswelt, the life world. And this losing the meaningful meanings production of life worlds was critically important. So what we see is a revolution of post-Soviet humans in very different levels, and it lasts, it creates its own logic, dialectics, up until the end of 21. So this is why I will show today how this continuity was organized and along which trajectories. And I argue in the book that the crystallization of this continuity between two caesuras, between two wars, was actually organized around four processes. So one is democratization, second marketization, third nationalization, and Europeanization. In a moment I will explain this difficult structure. It's quite simple, and definitely most of you will immediately recognize the references here. What I want to stress here, again, it's a continuity between two wars, end of Cold War and the beginning of new war in Europe. So far it's mainly in Ukraine, but let's don't fool ourselves. This caesura is not finished. And before I go to the next slide, also some ontological meaning of caesura. It's important for us to understand there's this anthropocultural type, Soviet man, post-Soviet humans, is not just a terminological game. It's actually a collective meaning of meeting with nothingness. In times of caesuras, we survive something when we collectively, intersubjectively, meet with bottomlessness of history, chaos, inability to understand what is going on, and recovery. Michel Foucault famously explains this collective meeting with nothingness through the reconstruction of what means new subject, human subject, individuality. What means truth or knowledge? What are the new regimes of truth? And what is power? Basically, from the caesura of 1989 to 91, post-Soviet humans come up as new subjects, as new competing types of regimes of truth, and new power structures. Again, if we accept the idea of these anthropocultural types and understand that human being has this destructive creativity in them, then it's easy to answer this question, how to assess certain era. Basically, I offer the consequentialist approach. Let's look at the results and let's try to understand them. In today's report, I'm looking only at political level, at the level of democratization, how successful Soviet man in self-overcoming was, in these post-Soviet humans, and how post-Soviet humans revealed themselves, their ontological, but also this political will to freedom in institutions, in collective achievements and outcomes. At the same time, I will argue that post-Soviet humans also revealed themselves in building and constructing authoritarian, autocratic results. Because we are, as human beings, we have many different strives in us, energies, to be free, but also to subdue, to be subjects. And in both cases, I take here just two polar ideas. In reality, it's much more in terms of political creativity. But here I will follow the Socrates and Kant's advice, look at the results of our deeds, and this is how can we compare the result with the motivation. So we definitely start with the quest for freedom in 91. And what is the result of it? Let's see a little bit later. Now, if we look at this post-Soviet tetrad, these four trajectories, and again, we remember that these trajectories are done by destructive, creative human beings, then we can look at democratization as destruction of one supreme power and a superstructure that exists for a long time in modernity times, from the moment of absolute state in Eastern Europe and northern Eurasia. For a long time there was a competition between Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth, Turkish Empire and emerging Russian Empire for the force that will be the basis of the supreme power, and it survives then for a long time different revolutions. You can see how in the end of 18th century, in 19th century constitutions, the first projects, Carstwo Polskie, for example, there was a constitution, but there were Decembrists, several projects of constitution. Then there were ideas, revolutionary ideas throughout 19th century and early 20th, and there was always constant debate about shall we preserve the supreme power or shall we follow the Western modernity path, and we'll create these checks and balances, three classical division into three classical branches. So here we see how in democratization, destruction of supreme power goes hand in hand with construction of these three branches, and also division for central and local governments. In some cases, like in Russian Federation, there were even bigger process, or more complex process in creating these divisions, especially in the beginning of 90s. Then marketization is connected with the destruction of administrative command economy. This is what it was called, this state capitalism of Soviet Union, and create open markets. And again, it's being created by someone who almost didn't know what market means. Yes, there was black market, and most of the urban dwellers of late Soviet Union knew how to deal it, but it's still not the real open market. But imagine that you have to create it. It's amazing to see also individual biographies at that time of major champions of economic development. Sofia Lamborghini defended her dissertation, I think in Sciences Po, or in Humboldt, I forgot. But she analyzed biographies of 6 first bankers in Russia. They were all coming from Vneshtorgbank of Soviet Union. But at individual level, you see how these people were inventing out of nothing the entire banking system in Russia. When I read her dissertation, I went to several friends and colleagues in Kyiv just to talk to them. They were the ones who were creating it in Ukraine. And it was amazing that they repeated the same phrase. Yeah, we were actually, within several months, we went to Washington, we looked at the banking system there, we went to Brussels, and then we made it up out of nothing with no first-hand experience. Imagine how radical is this creativity. Almost godlike, no? Then nationalization, so that we understand what this term is. We destroy complex state of Soviet Union, and then we create states, nation states, which means states with one majority. And immediately here, we have already contradiction. So in the first case, we have government with divided powers, so weak state. In the second case, we have neoliberal government, which is small, something that does not intervene into markets. And in the third case, we have huge government, because this state is being built hand in hand with the nation. Quite often it means that governments will create the nation, which means we will have huge government that will use educational system, cultural institutions, and many other ways in reconstructing the Soviet biomass into nation. This biomass is the term that in my interviews I heard from Uzbeki politicians of the early 90s, Ukrainian, Moldovan, Russian. Biomass comes from a science fiction movie of late Soviet Union, but it was applied for Soviet population that had to be remade, reshaped, reformed in the new states. So here already you see the contradictions that will move forward the entire history of post-Soviet Union. And the fourth element, the fourth trajectory, Europeanization, it was an attempt to decrease contradictions, to soften them within one big project, which was both internal and external. Internally, it means we will accept a number of European rules and norms and will make them part of our political and legal systems. At the same time, it means external, international project, because it's a new space, so autarky is destroyed, and we have a coexistence, peaceful coexistence and cooperation between Dublin to Vladivostok. Finally, we can start with the major issue today. So I will look at this democratization and internal contradictions within it. Democratization means creation of democratic institutions and reactions to that. And I will talk about what was achieved by 22, and I will use mainly the data provided by Varieties of Democracy database. Probably most of you know this database, but if not, I advise you to visit it. It has a number of tools for researchers from different areas to understand and compare processes in today's politics, globally, in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and so on. And I will use 4 categories for the post-Soviet countries. One category, more or less stable democracies where liberal component is strong. Second category is democracies with very weak liberal or unstable democratic liberal component. And then Russia and Uzbekistan as 2 cases where a country and a nation has experience in democratization and then chooses a long path to autocracy, or almost no experience of democratic life. And again, one last big warning. I'm coming from philosophy, political science, which is mainly shaped according to Western education. Kyiv-Mohyla Academy that Misha mentioned was a Western university on the soil of Ukraine. It was created in 1992 with no connection to Soviet experience, and it was trademark university, a boutique university, as many say, which was created by a bunch of professors from the West, United States, Canada, England, Germany, who cooperated with former party leader in Institute of Literature, Bruchovetsky, and together, two different types of experience, created this university. So I come with a number of biases, and in political theory, in political science that I know and I do, is connected with the idea that it's democracy that is substantial, and autocracy is rather a deficit of democracy. But while doing this research, I understand how limited is that approach. And if Europe needs to survive, part of our studies should become authoritarian studies, not even illiberal studies as we have a good center right in the United States. No, we have to accept the fact that autocracy is substantial, essential, and we can study it as a different type of political action, with its own logic, with its own institutions, and so on. But today, most of the instruments that I have, and also from the varieties of democracy database, even in the name of this database, we will mainly have tools that measure democratic action in different types. So here, the first one is connected with the idea of measuring how did we manage to destroy the supreme power and how stable this destruction was. Which means we can measure it how legislature and judiciary were limiting the powers of executive. So in this graph, you can see how legislature and executive power coexisted. So we immediately have Estonian case that gives us the best result, where legislature, as a parliamentary republic, legislature is above executive, is in firm control of the executive, and we have supreme power reconstructed pretty fast in Uzbeki case up until recent change of the ruler, but prediction is that everything will calm down and the ruler will continue as usually. But then two cases, Russian and Ukrainian, show different trajectories. Here, Ukraine has a number of periods when there was a supremacy of legislature and then supremacy of executive. Basically, it was a constitution of Ukraine, written and non-written, that created a constant competition of legislature and executive. Presidents and Rada were competing with each other for control over the cabinet. And hence, we have these waves. But these waves will be repeated in many other places in Ukraine, and we'll talk about it a little bit better. Here, you will see also Russian case when there's a certain democratization period with growing role of Duma, and then slow plateau and decrease of the role of parliament in both chambers to the level of Uzbekistan. Then let's look at the judiciary, and it's a different story a little bit. Here you again have two categories repeated, Uzbekistan and Estonia. In these cases, in both cases of these two countries and categories as such, which means Uzbekistan represents also Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan, and Azerbaijan. Kyrgyzstan is a little bit different. Periodically it's together with the rest of Central Asia. Periodically it joins the category where Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia are. Since 2018, this category also was joined by Armenia. And then only 3 countries are more or less stably liberal democracies, which are Baltic countries. But here, in terms of independence of judiciary, you can see that Russia repeats the same path as in legislative history, but here, Ukraine is not doing quite well. And it's connected with this constitution. So we have competition of legislature and executive, and one of the praise of this competition is judiciary, but also local governments. Up until 2015, when the local government reform started in Ukraine, local governance was also constantly pushed by this competition of the two. So we did not create very stable systems in most cases, as you can see. Then rule of law. That's the saddest story, because you can see that even in Ukrainian case, up until the moment when association agreement starts influencing Ukrainian political and legal system, we have rule of law, which means, and here every indicator is explained. So when we talk about rule of law, it means we measure extent to which laws are transparently, independently, and equally enforced, and of the level of compliance they receive from government officials. So these two branches, two generalizations come together, and they show how difficult it was in Ukraine to apply, to fulfill the norms. So we quite often, and one of my senior colleagues, historian of constitutional law, he said that Ukrainian history, or history of independent Ukraine, can be written by measuring how more parts of constitution is not implemented. So in the beginning, we can imagine it was more or less okay, and then there's constant decrease. More and more articles are just regarded as non-acting. Then elections. Arguably, elections were the most important elements of democracy in post-Soviet countries. So electoral process, the first electoral competition starts even before '89. In '88, when the first more or less free campaign in Soviet Union started for the new Supreme Council of Soviet Union. Please remember that Supreme Council of Soviet Union was a hybrid institution from the point of view of Western scholarship. So it was parliament, but it was also partially the upper part of executive. So later in post-Soviet times, we have, in all four cases, very big inclusion of citizens into voting. So we permanently have more than 50% of voters coming for elections. Not many old or seasoned democracies can show that result. So in a way, post-Soviet humans believed in elections. Especially, and that's also interesting, despite certain decrees, there's always more interest in presidential elections than in parliamentary. And here you also see how some certain seeds of autocracy are being used. In today's autocracy studies, in these first glimpses that we have, there's a new category which is called electoral autocracy. So elections are becoming more and more important for autocracies to get legitimacy of the rule. And at the same time, in democracies around the globe, we have arguably decline of the role of elections. The quality of elections are going down, and probably American case with this very complex and debatable quality of electoral system is one of the most visible issues. Again, if we look at democratization as such, when we study democratization, it usually consists of 5 indicators. Out of them, 3 are most important: electoral component of democracy, liberal component, and deliberative component. In this case, when we look at elections, again, we see after short crisis in Estonia, electoral democracy is established and works perfectly well, at the par with Germany, with Austria and other countries in EU. And that's also connected how the gravity of Western Europe was influencing post-Soviet humans in fulfilling the rules. Here it's visible. But in those countries where this gravity was smaller or none, we can see that elections were valued, but they were highly unstable. So in Ukrainian case, you see 3 waves. But it's even more interesting to look and compare them on this graph. This graph shows all 3 components in all 4 categories. Again, here is a huge and interesting story that needs more and more analysis. For example, you can see that elections are much more important in all 4 cases than any other element of democracy. Even in Uzbekistan, where elections are mere formality, election still has a semblance of democratic quality. when the rest are almost close to minimal. The deliberative process, deliberative process and liberal processes. However, here we can see that in Estonia, electoral component is more important than the rest. In Russia as well. In Ukraine, the difference is even bigger. So it also shows that competition, parties, and ideological pluralism were critically important in most of the cases. And by 22, you see that in most of the countries of the region, ideological pluralism is disappearing. Parties, the palette of parties is getting limited. There's more and more cases, except for Estonia, when it's not court that makes decisions about closing parties and so on. So it shows again that some democratic improvement was in place, and then we have waves. One wave in Russian case and 3 waves in Ukrainian case. So if we look at elections, there's a growing of electoral democracy in 90s, then decline under second term of Kuchma, then Orange Revolution, or the first Maidan, which improves the quality of electoral democracy and also some level of deliberation. The problem was with the liberal element, when the laws, norms would limit the influence of majority and of executive on individual rights and on the rights of minorities. And then the last big jump is connected with 2019, with electoral revolution of Zelensky. You can ask, what about Euromaidan? And here, the problem, the democratic quality of Euromaidan was hushed down because of the war. You basically, in 2015, 14-15, you have 2 agendas coming and clashing with each other. Agenda of Euromaidan, the liberal agenda, European agenda, and agenda of the war. And they are very different. So disciplined society versus free society, and so on. So here, this very difficult story can be seen in these graphs as well. And another, on the power of democracy, and I'll finish with that type of creativity, it's mobilization. So how this biomass that was declared to be a nation, and in my lifetime in Ukraine, the nation was both several times. In 1991, when a referendum was done. Then it was in 2004 when Orange Revolution was in place. And the third time in Euromaidan, and when the war started, another birth of the nation. So here you can see this birth of the nations, the labors, every time with the highest degrees of Ukrainian mass mobilization in support of democracy. Or, so when we measure this indicator, we look how protests support either principles or institutions or leaders that are seen as leaders of democracy. But you can also see Russian, 2 waves, 2 big waves. And in an interesting case in Estonia, you see some waves as well. But if you have functioning institutes, democratic institutes, the energy of masses is being channeled into the decision-making within the framework of these institutions. So you don't have revolutions or revolutionary change. And of course, this type of political system is much more stable. So here we see some democracies being created, some reactions, and we have in Ukrainian category some democratization, some autocratization, return to democratization, and instability. Same can be applied to Georgia with a little bit different wave stories, but again, they are there. In Armenia, now and in Moldova. Now autocratic, how the post-Soviet humans invested their life energies into subjection, into being obedient. Well, we don't have instruments to measure directly. We can say, oh, when the wave goes down, for example, in democratization in Ukraine, it means autocratization. Yes, it means decrease or decline of democracy, but we don't see the matter. What is actually there? If we say deficit, it means we don't have power structures, we don't have relations among big and small groups, individuals. No, we do. So one of the rare examples of the tools that can be applied is neo-patrimonial index. And here I will read it again loudly. What does it mean when we study or we gather data for neo-patrimonial rule index? It means that we study and reflect on the idea that personalistic forms of authority pervade formal institutions in a regime that combines patronal political relations, unrestricted presidentialism, and the use of state resources for its political legitimation. In other words, we formally see strong, established democratic institutions, but people, actors within them, behave in a different way. They organize themselves in different type of hierarchies based on personal relations. And there's always this core group, oligarchs, minigarchs, and groups around them. So with the pyramids that create the entire social structures. So here we have formal and informal relations. And then we will have like Lednyova's 2-volume encyclopedia or dictionary of informalities, or Henry Hale's patronal politics, or many other studies. One of them is the 2-volume book that was recently published, edited by Balint Magyar and Balint Madlovich, one dedicated to Russia, one dedicated to Ukraine, how patronal politics was functioning in times of war. And you see how the shock created by the beginning of the war is changing the political economy and the nature of power networks. But here we see that in outright autocracies, in autocratizing countries like in Russian case, but also in Ukraine, this neo-patrimonial rule is very strong. This is why Madlovich and Magyar offer two new categories: patronal democracy and patronal autocracy. And patronal democracy is applied to Ukraine, to Moldova, to Georgia, because it works. Then it explains the power distribution, the real power distribution, and formal institutions that are in the political system. So here we see that autocratic roots are connected to these pyramids. In case of Russia, it's one pyramid system. In case of Ukraine, for a long time, it was multi-pyramid, which were fighting with each other. And in this competition between the pyramids, Ukrainians had freedom. The rooms for media freedom, for civic freedom, for citizen association, and so on and so on. So in a way, even in this neo-patrimonial logic, the unusual, invisible for formal approach, formalist methods, rooms of freedom exist. But as structures and as pyramids, they are hostile to real freedom, to rule of law definitely, and it means this type of political freedom is very fragile, while autocratic functionality of autocracy were growing. Then ideological monopolization. It's a great tool that varieties of democracy use. And again, here, ideology index answers the question of the extent to which the government of a given country promotes a certain ideology in order to justify the existing regime. Post-Soviet history is connected with diversity of ideologies. It was already seen in 88, 89. It was flourishing throughout 90s. But starting from 2010, 2012, this decrease of pluralism is seen everywhere, including liberal democracies of the region. But the strictest the decrees are in Russia, and here we have a very strong empirically proven graph. And then you can see how revolutionary waves connect in Ukraine, or how in Uzbekistan this monopolization of ideology was from the very beginning. And in Estonia, basically this little bump shows that something is happening, but constitutional system and gravity of European structures are still strong for monopolization to be practiced that much. Although I think my Polish colleagues or Hungarian colleagues could argue that maybe here we have a harder situations. So creation of new ideologies, ideological monopolies is another investment that flourishes in post-Soviet countries. And the final graph, and sorry if I don't think I overtook the time, but the last one is connected with autocratic mobilization. Post-Soviet mass protests were also connected with the support of anti-democratic figures and anti-democratic norms and practices. In Ukraine, it's connected 2 times with anti-Maidan movements. And in the second time, anti-Maidan movement became the Russian-backed separatism and irredentism. In the first case, the separatist element was also there. There was a Congress that proclaimed the creation of Southeastern Ukrainian Republic, but it was hushed down. After Orange Revolution, Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yushchenko managed to reunite the nation. Well, but also you see how Russian wave of pro-autocracy mobilization was growing and steadily. And it's interesting that it starts before Putin coming in the picture. And it can be measured with KGB guys entering into the highest posts, Primakov, Stepashin, and only then Putin. So this can be also seen as measurable. In Estonia, these bumps are there, but they are small and not very strong. Interesting that mass mobilization for autocracy in Uzbekistan were in decline, and it's connected with the change of the ruler. The new ruler still needs time to regain the trust and to be sure that Uzbekistani population supports him. Well, Uzbekistani case is amazingly interesting also from a different point of view. In the beginning of this year, we published collected volumes, how philosophy developed in post-Soviet countries. So there's a Russian case, Uzbekistani case, Georgian, Ukrainian, Moldovan, and it's very interesting. I recommend it. The book is here in the library. I recommend it to look at it. But in Uzbekistani case, we have the saddest story. How fast, already in 1993, philosophy was put back under control. So basically, Uzbekistani philosophers witnessed certain freedom only for a couple of years. Indirectly, it shows that it's the ideological monopolization is going back. And it's connected with this twofold authoritarian agenda in Central Asia. First, religion must be under control. Islamist movements must be under control. And their governments are very secular. And the other one, liberal democracy, all the theories of this kind should not enter educational agenda. And this is how I interpret this crack on philosophy. So, finishing my today's intervention, mostly we can say that democratization failed. Democracies are very fragile, and only due to external pressures or gravities, democracies could survive. But in the times of this caesura, when the quality of democracy is under stress also in seasoned democracies, in old democracies, then we say that some democratic hope is there in the region, but it's minimal. Second, autocracies proved to be smart. Even in the case of Putin, when it was clearly that the war is a huge mistake and he faces the perspective of being toppled, this autocracy found solutions, how even to redo results, achievements of this mistake. But he and many other autocracies in post-Soviet countries show that they avoid this usual model. You remember the decision-making metrics in autocracy and democracy. In autocracy, it's slow, the process of decision-making is slow, all the parties are being involved, so less mistakes, more time. In autocracies, decision is made by a very small number of decision makers, and a number of mistakes are high, so at certain moment they produce mistakes, and there's a disruption of autocracies. In post-Soviet constellation, it doesn't work. Would I add here economic story? We will also see some very interesting, unusual discrepancy. So if households get more or less normal income, it's most probably that political niveau will be autocratic, and we have democracies with very low or minimal incomes of households. So basically, poorest economies of Ukraine and Moldova, Georgia is also not the best case of economic development, they are the freest. So we have institutionalized, constructed discrepancy or even contradiction between freedom and income. The state, post-Soviet state is fragile. It's interesting that even in autocracies, it's usually based on patronal politics, which means weakness of institutions. It's strength of a leader or of a group up on the summit of the pyramid, but it's not the strength of the state. Well, funeral of post-Soviet humans goes hand in hand with the funeral of one big Europe. We arguably can call this newly fragmented big region between Pacific and Atlantic Oceans as a region between the pole of Ulster to the pole of Magadan. And both Magadan and Ulster symbolize something that really is telling about what number of contradictions we live in this new caesura and the new epoch that is approaching us. So it's new caesura, and I would say that in this time and in the future, the Soviet experience is irrelevant. So there's no self-overcoming of a Soviet man anymore. We are in new regions, much more diverse in this area between Ulster and Magadan, but also we are in new times. Thank you.
So, take a seat, Mikhail. Okay, the first thing that strikes me is Soviet man, and of course we use the gender advisedly because that's how it was presented, was a vision, a project of a relatively small group of people playing with a large society. Post-Soviet humans, it seems to me there was no plan about post-Soviet humans. To what extent, and as you said yourself, with the banking system in Russia, they went to Washington for a few days and then had a look at the banks and then made it up, essentially, as you said. So to what extent are the vast majority of post-Soviet humans just, particularly in this initial phase, involved in survival? Because there are no rules, there are no plans, and why, in that case, do you see this differentiation begin to emerge? And of course, most striking of all is the wide discrepancy between Estonia and the rest, including Ukraine. So why does that start to happen?
Well, I think here is this story of external influences or gravities, institutional gravities, especially for Baltic countries. There, if you look at criminal statistics, for example, a number of homicides, I think Latvia and Russia were the champions for like 10 years in these terms. So criminal wars are there. Attempts of building these new clans were there. But still the influence of the West and political cultures that still preserve some elements from the first interwar period, they played well in the Baltic cases. In Central Asia, the most radical area, it's very interesting there. Again, biographical analysis. The members of a liberal Soviet team of Gorbachev become first authoritarian rulers, but also this authoritarianism tries to create dynasties. So, for example, by the end of 90s, you see how kids of rulers, they reach the moment when they are 18, 22, they start creating marriages, Akayev versus Nazarbayev, for example, one of the cases. But at the second level, you can see that it's done en masse. New clans, transnational clans that see the future. Or in the end of 90s, I was a coordinator of a Soros project that aimed to develop one textbook of history for all 5 Central Asian countries, for example. And there were 3 meetings of historians from Academy of Sciences, I think it was 99. And 3 times it ends with almost fighting during the public event. But in the evening, it ends with the fathers shaking hands about the marriages of their kids. So interestingly enough, this public and private is already separated, which didn't exist in Soviet times. It was super big public sphere with criminalized private life. And here, within 10 years, everywhere, post-Soviet humans installed this differentiation.
It's very interesting. I had a conversation with a senior former apparatchik in Moscow who was Estonian. I saw him in the early 2000s in Tallinn, and he argued that the inability by the late 80s of party members to transmit their privilege to their children was a key driver in the decision to get rid of Soviet man.
It can be the case, at least one of the driving forces, definitely.
Yeah. But the one thing I'd say where there was a slight anomaly in what you said at the end about the economy, that weaker economies mean more freedom. The Estonian experience contradicts that, because they're clearly by a very early stage, there's a very rapid differentiation between the Northwest and
also Latvia and Lithuania in this category.
Yeah.
But in all the others, so 12 cases of recognized states, and right now it's 3 surviving de facto states. In all these cases, this differentiation between richness and subjection are.
So, and then in another sense, the key country is Ukraine, where you seem to have a permanent sort of tension between autocracy and democracy. Why is it in Ukraine that we see that struggle so intensely?
For a long time, well, now it's very interesting that now that Soviet period is finished and we have a distance, maybe we will have also a clearer vision of whys, for example, if we believe in causes in social and historical process. But during when the Soviet period, post-Soviet period was still enrolling, one of the explanations was two Ukraines. I never was buying it, but that was like the hegemonic idea. So we have Western Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine means urban and industrialized, rural and less urbanized Western Ukraine, but different political cultures and different types of political logic. And but then if you look at the clan structure, neo-patrimonial politics, it doesn't matter whether the clan comes from Vinnytsia, as in Poroshenko case, or from Donetsk. They actually lost the contact with the local community, with constituency, within a year. They cease to cooperate, and at the local level you see how local constituency loses support. The ratings will fall down in Donetsk tremendously fast for Yanukovych, and same for Poroshenko. So they lose contact to the region, which means East-West does not answer the question. I would say that in Ukraine, this pluralist society, pluralist multicultural grounds were in constant shakes. The state institutions were very weak, so society was looking for its own way how to survive, and it continues to do so, also in supporting army even during the war. So it precedes, it's a longer history, it doesn't end with the post-Soviet history. But again, this fragility of state, that's probably the answer.
And finally, before I throw it over to the audience, so what you're arguing now is post-2022 and the new Caesura, we can sort of forget, except in terms of our interest in historical analysis, we can forget Soviet man as a definer of what's going on now. So to what extent does post-Soviet human continue, and to what extent does post-Soviet human adapt into something new? Or is indeed, I mean, has post-Soviet human really been sufficiently defined to be a useful category?
I think it was defined enough, but it was losing its identity in the last 10 years, I would say. And not only because we have anniversary of Euromaidan today. It's a longer process, and both Ukraine and Russia, for example, as societies, present a lot of surprises for us. How these populations survive this caesura. So money value is becoming very big. So the war that involves a lot of participants just for the money reason from Russian side. It's something unusual, but it's part of the revolution of 1991 as well. I remember the value of money was growing tremendously fast, but now it's becoming even more so. So this fetishism of money is, it's not a fetishism of a thing, it's a fetishism of money. It is growing. The value of life is decreasing tremendously. So there's no, again, this Putinist ideologist, Karaganov, I think, Karaganov, who spoke about fear. Yeah, Karaganov.
Yes, it was Karaganov.
Yeah. So fear is non-existent category, while fear in 90s was a very important issue. You probably remember this writer, the Belarus writer, Nobel Prize winner, Svetlana Alexievich. In her documentaries, where she actually gives the voice to post-Soviet human, you hear, especially in early 90s, you hear a lot of fear, worries. But that's a fear that doesn't stop you. it moves you to work, especially when she makes an interview with women. Women, they just get rid of their positions, jobs, teacher, librarian, and they become shuttle traders. And it's amazing how she talks to them, how she gives them the voice. Or the boys from Afghanistan, the fresh veterans, they're 22, 25-year-olds, how they organize themselves into mafia-like
organized crime.
Yeah, organized crime. And you feel how fear to lose social security, normal life, trajectory of your life. My parents, for example, they in 1991, they lost their trajectories. But as teachers, school system, you know, this budget system, it still provided some strange type of security. But for the rest, it wasn't. And it was driving people to become this money-oriented, independent, very daring people. And that's the history of post-Soviet humans.
So, and are you already thinking of what you're going to call the next type of human in this space?
I'm very attentive, but I must be Hegelian in this, and you know, look in every event, in every hint of a gestalt that appears. But as one Hegelian in Berlin said, it's Zeitenwende, so Zeitgeist should come and show itself.
Great, thanks, Mikhail. Let's go, Jan, first question.
Well, should I stand or?
No, just announce explain who you are and use the microphone.
Well, Mikhail, you called for your Polish colleagues, so here we are, Jan Farfel, Jerzy Giedroyć Fellow. Thank you for this very, very interesting talk. And since talking about your Hegelian approach, just trying to challenge somehow the relation between your qualitative approach to your quantitative data analysis. Because I will just relate briefly to two aspects that were absent from the talk. You touched briefly upon it while answering some of Misha's questions, but since you focus on the legacy of the Soviet man, how does it play into these older legacies? You mentioned that it's a political culture, but I mean you have Grzymala-Buz or Kotkin who make this much bigger argument about centuries-long legacies where, for example, you know, the Baltic countries having this interwar culture of parliamentary democracy would prove that perhaps you should put more attention towards those older legacies, you know, the division of the borderline. And then when we come to the legacies, there is another absent aspect. When you started telling the presentation of a Soviet man and then post-Soviet experience, I immediately thought about, you know, an ideal case study of Belarus. And the question is like, don't you see perhaps any selection bias in your approach where, for example, you can go with completely different results if you focus on Georgia, Ukraine versus, for example, Belarus and Uzbekistan or something like that?
Well, I wish it was the true, but Belarus is the case with Russia. We have a very strong and daring period of democracy with very strong diversity, ideological and party, which ends very fast. Ends in 1994. I still remember a discussion. I was a student at that time, and we met with our friends from Minsk, from wider Eastern Europe. And everyone was repeating this mantra that it's the last European dictatorship. I think it was 1998 when it was coined, like a wide spread definition. But no, here the Belarusian case is just a first Eastern European dictatorship that showed the path to Russia. I must admit that also Kiev was very attentive to institutional autocratic creativity in Minsk. I talked to 4 officials, 2 from Yeltsin team and 2 from Kuchma team, who were going in Minsk to study how they organized presidential administration. Because by the name, it was also in Russia. By the name, it was in Ukraine. But the functionality, so when it was real government that ruled formal and informal power relations, it was Lukashenko who invented it. And then in Russia, it was perfected to the most interesting way. So no, I would disagree. We could use, instead of Ukraine, Moldova. We could use Belarus instead of Russia, but we will still see the same kind of pattern or categories. And the first part was
about imperial legacy.
yes, and thank you for this. This is something that
The lack of legacies, like you can see that Hungary is very similar trajectory.
yes. I would say that I didn't mention this name, Hobbes. And right now I'm rereading not only Leviathan but also Behemoth, which means two types, two poles in political. Well, there's a certain antinomy, political antinomy between Leviathan and Behemoth, because Leviathan is constructed by a rational choice of giving up certain natural rights and freedoms, and then this human-made God works like to defend your security and your property. But on the other side, there's a behemoth, emotional politics. You emotionally get charged, and then disruption of order starts. You kill the king, so the embodiment of Leviathan, but also you die en masse because the civil war starts. So here we have these two elements. And I think in the beginning of modernity, Hobbes already saw the dynamics of modern state for a future. And still, these dynamics did not destroy something that existed even before these power relations, before the modern state, before all the Westphalian agreements and models and so on. So there's something prosaic about power relations. They, and especially in Eastern Europe, you definitely see that political cultures, personal relations survive whatever type of institution building there is. And the case of mafia state in Hungary is amazing for me, because I lived there in 2000-2001. I witnessed how promising democracy it was at that time, and a liberal champion who was changing his behavior at that time was an interesting figure. But it was also in post-Soviet constellations. I think about Panarin, who was a liberal in 80s, and by 2000 he was already an imperialist. Or in Ukraine you can see the same cases. Another prosaic thing here, so proteos, this essence without stable form, right, that goes whichever form there is. There's one thing that I see happening, and I don't know even how to phrase it. So I suspect that this belief, philosophical belief in strive for freedom, is hugely overestimated. I think human beings are more inclined to subdue, which means even the theory of power should be revised. Not only this authoritarian studies, it's something in human beings and human existence that we constantly create something that lives through us. We deny authenticity of individual, and we provide the dead to live through us, to keep our feet and legs. A drop of mysticism.
Slobodan.
Slobodan Markovic, Krzysztof Michalski Fellow at IWM, and former Freedom House analyst. I'll start from that. It's another like VDM, and we discussed a few weeks ago in Belgrade with Wolfgang Merkel, who works for VDM, and we have the same results, all the methodologies are different.
Yes.
Going from that, just to explain, most democratic countries, Western Norway or Finland, it has 100 points, and the least one is North Korea, 3 points. Now, you took those 4 cases out of the 15.
15 plus.
Yes, but if you take Soviet sphere and not the Soviet Union, I don't mean Warsaw Pact countries, but Soviet sphere, Mongolia is also part of it. Much more than any country in Europe. And this is where we come to a huge paradox. Hungary receded to the level, current level, which, by the way, is impossible by Freedom House methodology. It happened because Freedom House methodology distinguishes between consolidated and non-consolidated democracy. So if you once become a consolidated democracy, you are supposed never to sink back. It's not that Hungary sank to non-consolidated. It sank 2 categorical points down to hybrid or transitional regimes. And now Mongolia is better ranked than the United States. It has 84 points as opposed to 83 points that is the current level of the United States. So, you know, simply out of this. And in connection with that is something that, first of all, it was a brilliant lecture. Thank you very much. So many points that you made and raised. And one was you actually contemplated about the fact that you had very Western education and that maybe there could be some lacunas coming from that. And from that point of view, you already mentioned that you think more and more about this submission of humans. But I was also seeing that something was wrong in Freedom House parameters. They never reveal everything that's happening in some country. And when we speak about the quest for freedom, which was the beginning of your lecture, I just wonder whether people in 1989, the Soviet man, was dominantly in the quest of freedom or dominantly in the quest of consumerism. Because if you read Kremlologists, nobody reads them anymore, but coming from Yugoslavia, we had to read them. And they noticed 2 things, that in the 1970s and 80s, Soviet men were so hungry of Western rock music and so hungry of Italian shoes, which were coming from Yugoslavia, so that's why Yugoslavia was so...
I know, I had them.
Okay. And there were queues, you know, like 5-kilometer queues. An American sociologist asked some of them, why do you wait? It's obvious, because you have to renew queue every single day. And people said, because we could tell to others we were in the queue. So the point, even if you can't get goods, you were in the queue awaiting goods, just telling you how much important it was. So if they were in the quest of consumerism,
well, this definitely was there.
That's something that succeeded. That's the point. We don't measure it, but that succeeded, and Putin is a great master in that, and all other autocrats. And finally, do we here speak about 4 nation states? Is Russia really a nation state? And that's, I ask because my late colleague, Christopher Cocker from LSE, he wrote a book entitled The Civilizational State, in which he basically argued that China, Russia, possibly India as well, are not nation states. They don't see their elites not define themselves. Xi Jinping and Putin and some people around Putin, those who at least believe in Euro-Asianism, they say, no, we are not nation state, we are the civilization of itself. So maybe, you know, it's all a little bit, takes us a little bit aside from mainstream liberal deliberations, but a lot of things that should be also included, perhaps.
Well, with Chris, we had a conversation, night-long conversation, when it was still possible to go to Russia and have debates. I think it was 2010 or 11 in Golitsyn. And he actually agreed with the fact that civilizational state is more a metaphor than a well-defined concept. because we both agreed that still, I think it was Toynbee's expression, civilizations don't gather taxes. So, and state needs to gather taxes, to have borders, and so on and so on. But definitely this hegemonic democracy theory and connected to it political science and measurements, there's definitely a big field of invisibility or blindness for this methodology. And it's not only in consumerist capitalism. I think when Rogers Brubaker constantly argues with the against democracy theory and shows, look guys, this nationalization works against the idea that nation state is the best state for democracy, he never been listened to, neither in 90s nor when his book 2011 was published. And then these informalities. Vlad Tismanianu in 2009 publishes this book that cries. He says, oh, I remember how in early 90s we were sure that Central European, post-communist countries and Soviet countries will follow different pattern. And then, he says, from Visegrad to Vladivostok, it's the same like type of power networks. So we already, by that time, after 20 years, we felt that there's something happening with our approaches. I cover it in the book, not in the report. It's in the book, I tried to look how we imagine. So the first chapter is about events, a common rhythm in post-Soviet history. Then how we imagined during that period, so transitology, and something that was on the margins and we thought that it never will influence our vision and so on, like Duginets or Fomenkovits or like ethnogenetics. And they are much more powerful on decision makers today, democracy or non-democracy it is in post-Soviet world and arguably in post-communist countries. So we didn't see many other theories coming up, making influences on our populations and on elites. Well, it's a lesson to us also that something, we should really become like neorealists in, not only in IR, but in a reality that is much richer than our methods to measure it and study. Thank you.
Mikhail, thanks very much. And we've more or less come to our end, except we haven't, because there is, of course, wine and cheese downstairs where we can carry on the conversation, and perhaps somebody will be able to tell me why North Korea gets 3 points on the democracy index, because I'm struggling with that one.
Well, -3.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.